Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 306 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Mary Rickert, author of the short story collection You Have Never Been Here. She's also the author of two previous short story collections, Map of Dreams and Holiday, as well as the novel The Memory Garden. She's worked as a kindergarten teacher, a barista, and a Disneyland balloon vendor, and her writing has received the Crawford Award, the World Fantasy Award, and the Shirley Jackson Award. And now, here's our interview with Mary Rickert. All right, so we're here with Mary Rickert. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, so it says in your bio that you used to work as a Disneyland balloon vendor. So tell us about that.
Yes, I worked in Disneyland. I was in the concession department. So each day I would go to work and they'd assign me to a different place. Sometimes I sold balloons, sometimes I sold popcorn, and sometimes I sold ice cream in various locations around the park. And but my favorite was selling the balloons, walking around with the giant bouquet of balloons. Though they didn't let me do it too often because I was always losing balloons. They were just floating. I don't understand to this day how it happened, but I didn't get to do that too often. But it was my favorite. People were really friendly. I enjoyed being friendly to them. It was a nice place to work. And I liked the people watching. I would have to say that was a really good job for me for people watching as a writer.
Are there any people that you watched that stand out in your mind?
I remember, I don't remember the name of this. I don't even know if it's called the disease or not, but I always remember waiting on a little boy who suffered from that condition where you age prematurely. And I just remember him. I had not come across that before. And I do actually, all these years later, remember certain people. I remember a couple that had just gotten engaged and were just so happy to share it with me. And it was just a lovely moment. And I remember I was another little boy. And when I think he gave me the money and I gave him the change and I called him Sir. And you would have thought it was the most magical thing that happened to him in Disneyland. So just little moments like that.
Do you remember which balloons those people bought?
Well, the balloons I sold were just different colors.
Oh,
round balloons, not character balloons. And I do remember a young boy, probably, junior high, who really wanted a balloon and didn't have the money and just wanted me to give him a balloon. And I said, well, I really can't do that, but I have money. And so I showed him, that I was paying for the balloon and took it out of, my little purse or whatever I had and put it in the pocket for paying and gave him the balloon. And then he was in love with me. And I remember that. He was very enchanted. Kindness matters. I've learned that in all my odd little jobs that I used to have. Looking someone in the eyes, boy, that can really change someone's few minutes of interaction, actually feeling like they're being seen, really talking to people and really just responding to them made a big difference. And I enjoyed that experience.
So how did you end up leaving that job?
Well, how did I end up leaving that job? I think it was first, the way they used to do it. First, I was hired for the summer. And then I was offered to stay on, but my memory is that they couldn't guarantee enough hours. So I think I was 18 or 19, and I was supporting myself, and I had to know that I was going to get enough hours. So I left that, and I'm not sure if I went into it. I think I might have gone into a preschool after that.
Well, yeah, so when you say that you had all these different little jobs, what were some of those other little jobs that you've done?
let's see. I worked as in a coffee shop when coffee shops came around, but I started out working in a Pioneer Chicken in California, which is, kind of like a fast food place. I don't even know if they still have them anymore. That was my first job out of high school. I worked as a photographer's assistant, supposedly. I'm very not mechanically confident or really competent in any way. And I confess to having maybe a weird intelligence, since I think, I can write and I can think about things, and I have an intelligence that sometimes I would get myself hired for things that then I just I don't know, just couldn't do. I think as I got older, I realized I had some dyslexia, and the part of the brain that does maps and any of that kind of thinking, it's very hard for me. So I was sort of this photographer's assistant, but he became really unhappy with me because I put some fluid in the wrong part of a machine, and so I would have a lot of things like that happen. And I worked in a bookstore, and then at some point in all of this, I worked in the preschools in California, and that was a real match for me. I really enjoyed working with children, and I went from preschool to preschool until eventually I was hired to work as a kindergarten teacher in a private school for gifted children in California, and I stayed there for like 10 years.
And then you left that because you wanted to pursue writing, is that right?
It is. I wouldn't have been able to explain it at the time. I knew I wanted to pursue writing, and I knew I wasn't really doing it, but even when I quit, the woman I worked for said, well, but you could still write and work as a teacher. And for sure I could have. And I really enjoyed teaching, and I was in a very nice situation for myself. But I think what something in me knew is that, I had to toughen up a little bit. And I had to prioritize the writing, but there was some part of me that was just a little too settled at that point. And even though I had all the time, and I told people I wrote, and I kind of wrote, I futzed around with poetry, but I just didn't have the drive to do it. And I also just don't think I had, just enough mettle to do it. And so I quit my job as a teacher, and then things did become much more difficult for me, which, wasn't great. But I see that I learned during those years, well, this is going to sound kind of silly, but I feel like it's true that we live obviously in these lives of our bodies, and through the experiences, I learned how to construct good sentences or better sentences, and how to construct narrative by living my own life story.
You say in the acknowledgments, you say, during my years as an apprentice writer, I often struggled financially. Could you talk about what that was like?
Well, yeah, I'm sure it isn't any more extreme than others have gone through, and certainly not any more than some people are born into, but it was challenging. It was challenging, and it was also probably good for me to see, because I didn't have, even when I was a kindergarten teacher, I didn't have a college degree. And so when I quit that job, I just wasn't lucky again. I just kept finding sort of minimum wage paying jobs, and no insurance, and just finding out how sort of lonely that kind of existence can be, and how challenging it can be. People don't really understand. I remember, I almost feel I'm a little embarrassed to talk about this, because I do want to make clear that I understand that people struggle, and people come from much more difficult circumstances. And but this is my experience. So it was odd to me to say to somebody, oh, well, I don't have food. And no, I don't know that TV show because, of course, I don't have a TV. And so many people would offer me their TVs, but not really understand the food thing. And as I say, it was my responsibility. I was not very good at putting my life together during that time. But I got through it, and I did, as I said, I feel like I learned during that period about how a person can say one thing and the other person hears something else. I feel I have a little bit more understanding about financial struggles that people experience their entire lives and about cultural differences. Just everybody sort of has a baseline of understanding, and to realize even now that I have that too, rooted in experience, rooted in reading, rooted in what I know of the world, and just to always understand that there's experience beyond that baseline, that someone might be saying something to me or a character might be going through, and I should try to be aware that it's hidden, but there.
So then when did you first start having success as a writer?
I'm trying to decide how to describe success. I did enjoy my time in poetry, and I did get some poetry published, and I felt some success with that experience. At a certain point, I realized, that I felt that I'd fairly quickly reached my limitations in poetry. But when I took all my poems out and looked at them, I saw that a lot of them had stories in them, and I decided to start writing short stories. And then, I don't know, I think it took, 10 years before I got one published. There were maybe a few I know there were a few small literary journals, that paid with copies of the journal the story was in, and sometimes those never even appeared. And then so the first publication that I felt was, really a significant publication and a success in that regard was the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, and getting a story published there. After that, I felt like everything was different. And at the time, I didn't know very many people. I mean, I wasn't a member of the community. I wasn't aware of conventions and all of that. And but at a certain point, when I did get to know people, I understood that the ideas at the time were, send to the different magazines and develop a wide audience. But I was just happy to send to Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, and Gordon liked what I was doing, and I was really happy with that experience and connecting with readers, and I felt successful then. Until then, I had times where I didn't feel successful again, but it meant a lot to me to start being published.
Well, it's funny because, I and most of my friends spent 15 years trying to sell to Gordon Van Gelder at the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction without success. So,
yeah.
Did you have any awareness at the time that this was such a difficult thing, or you're just kind of like, oh, that's nice, this magazine bought my story?
Well, I thought all publishing was really difficult, and I thought that I had reached a point where I really became uncertain about what I was doing. And then I discovered the anthology, The Year's Best Fantasy and Horror, at my local library, and I just started checking them out. It used to be published by Tor, with Terry Windling and Ellen Datlow as editors. So I just kept checking them out and checking them out. And I was like, well, this is what I'm writing, because for years I was sending things to people who said, well, this is kind of odd, So, and then I looked through those anthologies and I saw, and the things that I'm writing seem to be published by this particular magazine. So I sent it out. And while it was out, I was thinking, if that story comes back from there, I don't know what I'm going to do, not in any, dramatic way, but in the way of like, maybe this isn't the right thing for me. Maybe I should start thinking of something else, because I feel like that's the place for my work. And so I was thrilled, and I didn't know of its standing. I didn't know of the science fiction fantasy as a community. I didn't know of all that. But for me personally, it was a very, very big deal. And I was quite appreciative of it.
Well, right. And then Gordon went on to publish a number of your stories, to the extent that you actually dedicated this collection to him.
Yes. He published quite a few of my stories, actually. And back to that first story, which I'm not a great speller. And I think I was even worse then, because I wasn't aware that I wasn't a great speller. And the fact that he looked through all of that and still saw the story and read it again and said, well, there really is something here, even if her spelling isn't very good. And so that meant a lot to me too, that he looked again and read it, and I really appreciated that. So yeah, he is somebody whose selection of my work really made a big difference in my life.
Yeah, and so then also in the acknowledgments you say, thank you as well to the Vermont College of Fine Arts for accepting me into the MFA program in spite of the deficits I brought to my application. So where in the chronology did you do that, and what deficits are you referring to?
I'm sorry. Well, the biggest deficit was I never did get a bachelor's. So I decided really just a few years ago that I think we're talking like under 5 years ago, I decided that I would really like to teach writing. And because again, I had short stories published, but I just felt like I had this longing. I had more that I wanted to give. And I enjoyed my years as a kindergarten teacher, and I felt really almost a calling that I would like to teach writing. Well, I didn't really think anybody would hire me for that if I didn't have at least an MFA. So I told a friend, I'm going to finish up my bachelor's, and then I'm going to apply for MFA programs. My friend, who has enormous faith in me, said, well, just apply to the MFA programs. So I started looking, and in a lot of the programs, it's sort of small print and hidden. There usually was a comment saying, we sometimes accept people who don't have a bachelor's. So I applied to Vermont College of Fine Arts, and I was thrilled to get into the program, and part of the application process was a critical paper. Well, I had no idea how to do a critical paper, so I just sent in what was basically kind of a book report, and they accepted me, and I really, really appreciated that. And it was it also was a life-changing event for me, So part of that program is that for the 2 years, and it's a low residency program, so I stayed at home and I would send packets to mentors and then go on campus every 6 months or so. And part of the program is that I would do critical papers with each packet, and then the third semester was a longer critical paper. And the fourth semester is a lecture, along with doing the creative work. Something about doing that critical paperwork and that longer critical piece gave me a confidence in my thinking that I hadn't had before. And so I said it to somebody that was like, it was as though I was dragging this shadow around my whole life. And I did this MFA program, and I slipped that on, and it was like, I don't have to drag that around anymore. And that confidence that I gained from doing that work, I can see directly applied to working on novels, which was another, backing up a little bit. I wanted to teach, and also I had given up trying to write novels because I just had been trying to do it for years and years, and I couldn't figure it out. So when I went into the program, though, I had started writing something that I thought might be a novel. And going through that program, I really felt like it helped me find the novel voice that I hadn't been able to find on my own, which was also really meaningful to me. So I graduated, and I never did get a job teaching writing. I applied for some things, but I do private mentoring, and I really enjoy that. And I was able to write a novel, which I hadn't been able to do before.
So that private mentoring, is that something if people go to your website that they can email you about it, or is it limited to people that you know or something?
Oh, people can email me about it. I think I have my website. I have to really get back to my website and revamp that. But I think there's something on there about contacting me personally, just emailing me with, a link, and then I respond. So I do novels and short stories. I enjoy that very much, and I consider it an honor.
No, that's great. And actually, I was kind of curious, speaking of writing a novel, one of the stories in this book, it's called The Mothers of Ville, is much, much longer than the rest. It's about 100 pages long. And I was curious if that was that a warm-up to writing a novel, or?
I think it was. When I first wrote that, it was actually novel length, for sure. But what happened was, what I used to do is I would write and I'd be, well, this is too short. And then I would just sort of shove stuff into it to try to make it novel length. And all my attempts at novels ended up feeling like that, like kind of disjointed, kind of monstrous, and not in a good way. And Mothers of Ville was one of those. It was novel length when I finished it. And there was something wrong with that. And then I decided to just go the other direction, and I shortened it to novella length, and I wrote 3 connected novellas. The Mothers of Ville, something called Pretty Brutal, and a third one called 5 Days in Stone. And my idea was that I would try to publish those 3 connected novellas as a novel. And that didn't work. But some point in there, Liz Gorinsky saw it. I think I might have sent Tor the 3 connected novellas, and she really liked The Mothers of Ville. She and Irene Gallo had seen it, and both really liked it. And then even that took like a couple years. I think it took like a couple years, and they came back. I mean, they'd seen it, liked it, if I'm remembering this right, for some reason kind of passed on it, and then came back to me later and said, I'd really like to look at that again. So they published The Mothers of Ville on Tor.com online. And that's where it got published first. But yes, it was a novel attempt.
Do you want to say a little bit more about just the premise of the story? It's sort of kind of Rosemary's Baby sort of thing?
Well, I had actually forgotten until, and I don't even know how to pronounce this word, Wacko?
Oh, Waco.
The Branch Davidians, Waco. Branch Davidian compound. I was influenced by that. I wrote it many, 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 many years later, and it was kind of a confluence of influences. But I know that was in there, and it was this, idea of people being held in a building and trying to have the premise of the story is that these women all start getting pregnant from the same man, and they start giving birth to babies that have wings. And they all think this is a secret until they end up in this farmhouse together and discover that they share this. During that time in the farmhouse together, they come to various conclusions about these winged babies as being good or evil. And in the meantime, the surrounding community and the law enforcement comes to believe that the babies are evil. And so the premise of the story really is, what do you do? What's the old problem, what to do about evil, and what to do with the evil that we produce as humans.
Well, there's a line in the story where it says, we do not know what our children will grow into. No mother can know that. That really struck me. It seems like that's kind of what the story is about, is that that you love your children even though you don't know who they really are and what they're really going to become.
Yes, but there is a very clear point in the story where at least some of these babies do something that's just undeniably horrific. And so it also kind of goes with that idea of, we're not sure what's going to happen, but we're not really taking responsibility for what we've already produced. And not just as women or mothers, but I think of it as a society, as a story about the obligations of evil in society. And I'm thinking about this a lot lately, how, the things that we consider quite good can become very fetid in the wrong circumstances. There's nothing wrong. I mean, it's quite beautiful and profound to forgive until that forgiveness becomes an excuse for allowing evil to continue. That sort of thinking.
Well, when you're talking about the obligations of mothers, I think it's really interesting to look at this story alongside another story in this collection, which is called Anyway, where the premise is basically that through magic, a woman whose son is going off to war, she can guarantee that he's going to survive, but if she were to sacrifice him, it would end wars forever. And does she have an obligation to sacrifice her own son? It seems like kind of she does, to me, but how do you see that?
I see it as complicated. It's so easy, to make these decisions in theory, not dismissing what seems to you to be an obvious choice. I understand that. But in reality, when any of these forces come close to home, people seem to struggle with them quite a bit, and I suppose I would too. It's so, some things are so clear at a distance, but when it's in your own house, in your own family, it can become very painful and very difficult to choose.
Well, no, I absolutely agree that it would be emotionally, it would be a horrible decision to have to make. But it's just from a utilitarian perspective or something, if you're weighing the lives of everyone who will ever die in all future wars against one life. It seems like it's hard to, just analyzing that dispassionately, you would have an obligation to do that.
Well, yeah. How do you take the human out of being human? Dispassionately, it does seem really, really obvious. And I think there are some people who have the strength to make such choices, and probably have, in times of war and in times that aren't of war, that are just like at the edge of great discomfort and great political change in the world. But I agree with you that dispassionately, the choice is really obvious. Mm-hmm. It's just not so easy, I think, for mothers or fathers, but the story focuses on the mothers, or the mother in that story.
Yeah.
I think I was oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, if I'm remembering right, I was influenced at the time by news stories I was reading about how many women had supported going to war in Iraq, because the feeling, at least the quotes I was reading in articles at the time was, let's do it over there. It'll be better if we do it over there. And I want my community to be safe, and I want my children to be safe. And so let's go to war. But a lot of the people who were voting that way weren't the ones who were sending their children to war, because again, it's comes into a class issue.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you're talking about children, I mean, that's one thing that really struck me about these stories, is that you seem to have such a good handle on what it's like to be a kid, in a way that I was reading the stories and it was kind of reminding me of things that I'd sort of forgotten about. So, for example, in the story of the Christmas Witch, that you have these experiences like you come home and you're expecting your parents to be there, and they're just not there for whatever reason. They're running late or something. You just start crying because you're like, I have no idea what to do without my parents here.
Yeah.
And then just the experience also of hearing an adult say something and you just repeat it, not even really knowing what it even means, and you get punished for that because people are like, oh, that's a horrible thing to say. All these experiences probably most everyone has, and I had just sort of forgotten about them, and reading the story just brought it back to me so vividly.
I don't know if I could do it anymore. I think that was all those years working with children, because I was a kindergarten teacher for 10 years, and then I was a nanny, and I worked in preschools before that. So I think I used to have a pretty close understanding of children and their lives, and some concern about that. I seem to gravitate more towards old woman.
But I think so. What do you? Because there's actually a lot of discussion of this in The Chambered Fruit, where you talk about children not playing the piano or kicking soccer balls. They just kind of sit in front of the television and they don't play, and they just are hypnotized by the electronic devices and stuff. Do you still feel that that's kind of a problem that's going on?
I don't know if it is a problem that's going on, because where I live now in Wisconsin, in this little town, I see children playing all the time. I mean, children are on their bicycles and running down the streets, but the community I lived in when I wrote that, it did seem like I just never saw children. The streets were empty, the parks were empty, and that was like a long time ago. I think that probably what parents struggle with is finding some balance between the screen time and the time on the grass. But I do think it's really important to get some time, just having the experience of, for children, I think it's important to learn, if you take your hand and you make a big circle in the air, you're creating, you're doing something to the space around you, and you're actually taking up space, as opposed to making a little circle on a screen. I think it's an important thing about having the experience of a body that should be preserved. But I do understand that we've entered, an age where children have games that are different from the games I had, of course. But I do think it's really important to learn that, because I think that extends to the emotional life, to understand just how things work on a physical plane before, at least so that there's equal value to that as there is to the virtual plane.
What was that community you lived in before where there were no kids on the street?
I lived in upstate New York.
And do you think it's still like that there now? Maybe it's just so cold outside, nobody goes outside.
I don't know. I don't know. It was when computers first came on the scene and the cell phones, everything seemed, I don't know, in my mind, it all sort of appeared at the same time, which I know isn't correct. But remember, there was that period of time where all the conversations were about it. Everything was about this new technical thing, and then people would be showing, come look at this, and I'll show you how this works. And I just thought it was so boring, and it just seemed like everybody was a little over enchanted by it for quite a while. And now to me it seems like it's evened out. It's plumbing. Everybody has it. It works. Where it's really nice to have. There's great advantages to it, but we don't have to talk about it all the time, and we don't have to show each other, look at what my machine can do, look what my toilet does. We just kind of have an acceptance of it that I actually really appreciate and seem to be working through some balance with it. But there was that period of time where it was just taking over all interactions.
Well, I don't know, it sounds like you don't spend a lot of time on the internet, and so I don't know if you're aware of this, but people on the internet are awful. So
I know they are. I do. I actually spend probably more time than it sounds like, but people, yes, and I would say that now, even I've run into a few times where I've been misunderstood. And I was talking about, baseline. Well, right now it seems like everybody just assumes that all the people are angry. The baseline seems to be, well, you're annoyed, even when you're not, And I did learn that younger people tend to find exclamation marks, they think it's angry, where to me, exclamation marks were always joyful. So, but I have found that people are quite horrible to each other on a lot of places on the internet.
Well, if you're writing in all caps, people are going to think that you're angry. So just want to...
Yes. I try to stay away from all caps.
Well, so you have had good interactions, though, with people on Right, because you say in your in the book, over the years, I've been happy to meet either in person or through email many people who have taken the time to tell me they enjoyed something I wrote. These exchanges are some of the highlights of my life.
Yes, so nice, so nice. I have met people, that I've never even met, but through Facebook or whatnot, that are just lovely people, and I would say in my Facebook feed is actually quite lovely. I don't have a lot of angry people. There's people posting art, and there's people posting poetry. There was one woman who was posting a lot of quite beautiful forms of song that I really enjoyed. And then people who have reached out to me as a writer, who read something of mine that they liked. I mean, this isn't happening, like on a massive scale or anything, but I appreciate it so much. And I've mostly had lovely exchanges. And anything that hasn't been lovely has really just, for me, been misunderstandings that we've been able to work through. I know other people have had horrible experiences, and I haven't had that.
I mean, when you think about fan mail and stuff like that, are there any particular letters that stand out in your mind where someone says, I really connected with this story, or it made a big change in my life, or anything like that?
Yeah, for my novel, which is about forgiveness. A young man wrote to me and wrote a very, very lovely several-page letter about that. I don't think I'm betraying too much confidence since I'm not saying his name. It meant a lot to me. He said he had found a way to understand about forgiveness that he hadn't experienced before and how it impacted his life, and that meant a lot to me. And then mostly other than that, like short notes. I know I got a nice note from a man in Australia who had read the story Bread and Bombs, which isn't in this collection, and how much that had moved him. So, things like that it's just really nice to hear as a writer.
Well, I mean, also in this book, you talk about your friends understanding your need for solitude. And I was just curious about that. Like, how much solitude do you feel like you need?
I need a lot of solitude. I do. I need, even when my husband and I go on vacation and we just go up north and we stay in a small town in northern Wisconsin. And I've noticed over the years that it's just pleasant. We're just pleasant. We're not, neither of us are busy people, and we have relaxing days. And at a certain point in the day, I say, well, I'm going to go back to the room, and I go back to our little room and I play my music and I just read. And even though it's beautiful outside, or I could sit in some cafe, I need to be alone for at least a couple hours. And then, I don't enjoy parties for the most part. They kind of baffle me. And most of the things that people seem to enjoy socializing, I don't. I do like, one-on-one talks with a friend occasionally. But especially I've noticed with novel writing that I seem to really need to burrow in. And then I'm not writing all day. I'm not writing, 10-hour days. But even when I'm finished, if I put in 4 or 5 hours, then I need to not talk to anyone or even be around people. I just kind of need to close off. And I had one sort of beginning friendship that she just didn't understand that, and I don't know how to make somebody feel better about it. It's just the way it is. I try to be really clear that that's who I am, and it's not a reflection of anything lacking in the other person. But I guess some people find it odd. So I really enjoy the friends I have who are just really supportive of who I am. Well, and my family too.
You mentioned a couple of writers, Sophia Samatar and Christopher Barzak and Karen Joy Fowler. Are those people you keep in touch with? I
keep in touch with Christopher Barzak. He and I used to be quite the pen pals, email back and forth, and then as our lives get busier, we go through waves, But and Sophia and I, we never really did keep in touch a lot, or even very much. But I enjoyed her company, and I really like her work as all of them. And Karen Joy Fowler, I'm not sure. I know she wrote a blurb for my novel, which I very much appreciated, but we don't really know each other.
Uh-huh. And I was also just kind of curious, you write a lot about crime and sort of disturbing topics like that. I was just curious if you are you a big fan of true crime books and shows or things, or like how do you research crime stuff at all?
I used to. I really I mean, ever since I was young, I've been fascinated. Oh, fascinated's too pretty of a word. I've been curious about why people behave the way they do and what effect that has on humanity. And so I do read true crime, though not as much lately. I picked something up from the library. I don't even remember what it was a few weeks ago. I really, really well written true crime almost always really talks about place so well. And place almost becomes one of the characters in a lot of true crime, which I find really interesting. And I'll go back and forth. I might be looking at the TV and I'll be like, no, I don't want to watch any of that. But if I do just start watching, I'm usually quite compelled. And I'll watch something and I'll be like, oh, I really want this to end differently, but it doesn't. I just, I've been lucky. I really haven't experienced any of these horrible things. And I think sometimes people think maybe I had, but I haven't. But I've just always been really curious and concerned about the way people behave. And I guess half the time I'm trying to change the ending. But it doesn't work.
There was this thing on Netflix in the last year or two. It was called Making a Murderer. And my girlfriend watched that and got just totally captivated by it. And then we watched a whole bunch of other true crime things subsequently. And, you do get you enjoy watching it, but as one of the characters in one of these stories says, she sort of thinks she's angry about the thought of people enjoying themselves, reading about her story and her suffering. I was just curious how you feel do you ever feel, I don't know, guilty about enjoying true crime stories or anything like that?
Yeah, I think it's important to investigate those feelings. A person might say, I really enjoyed that, and then might look at it more closely and say, well, actually, that really wasn't enjoyment, I think sometimes we just say the word that we associate with the medium. You watch TV, you enjoy it, or it's a movie, I enjoy it. But I don't think most people are actually enjoying it. But I think but compelled by it, and it speaks to something real about the human experience, and I think we have a need for that we want to, and I think it's not bad to want to investigate evil and to do it in an adult, mature way where we're not just saying, you're going to be able to recognize evil because it doesn't look like you. Well, yeah, a lot of times it does. And I think that there's this thing in our society that kind of does make people feel like, whoa, if you're watching that and eating your popcorn at the same time, you are evil. But then what happens is we have a society where people are not even able, some people are not even able to recognize evil or unkindness or cruelty because it's coming in the shape of charisma or beauty or attraction. And so, yeah, I have had times where I'm like, oh, God, what is this? Why am I doing that? Why am I watching this? But I think when I really chuck myself, I feel like it's not a bad thing to do, and I think it can even be an important thing to do.
Okay, so we're running a little short on time here. We did have a listener question for you on Facebook from Jonathan Graham. He says, ask her about Small Beer Press. It's quickly becoming my favorite imprint for speculative short fiction. So could you just talk about your experience with Small Beer Press?
Well, Small Beer Press is great. You know, as Jonathan Graham said, it's known. People who know what Small Beer Press is doing seem to be looking for particular kinds of work and a kind of quality that you can find there. Gavin and Kelly are, very supportive. They worked really closely with me and really good editors, kind people, and have given a lot to the field.
Did they approach you about doing this book, or did you approach them?
I know for years I wanted to publish with Small Beer. And then I just remember, and I don't go to conventions very often, but I was at a convention, and I remember I was, I met Gavin for tea, and I think that's where we decided that we would do this. But they knew I wanted to publish with them because I had tried for years too. So I'm not quite sure how the details of this happened. But I would say that they knew I was very much wanted to work with them.
Was it difficult picking which stories you were going to include, or was it kind of now you knew which ones you wanted to include?
It was difficult. I had a plan to do more news stories than I did do. And what happened was during that period of time, my mother died, and she was, elderly, and it wasn't a terrible, long, lingering death, but it still took me off my feet for a while, and I was quite unnerved, and I was having trouble writing the stories I had committed to. So Gavin and Kelly were very supportive, and I just used one news story. So then when I started looking at what I wanted to do, I knew I saw something happening between stories that were about identity and about what it is to be human, and I knew that I wanted to have a feeling of that. And then once I decided that I was going to title it "You Have Never Been Here," which is based on one of the short story titles, then I knew, okay, this is what, I know people don't usually read short story collections in order, but if they did read it in order, I wanted it to be an experience of that idea. Who are you? What does it mean to be human?
Uh-huh. And then I was also just kind of curious to ask you, in one of these stories, there is a character, or some of the characters have a writing group. It's a memoir writing group in the story. And it's not the most positive portrayal of a writing group. It talks about, it kind of turns into, you say it turns more into sort of a group therapy session than a writing workshop. And in another story, there's a workshop that sort of excludes people if they write fantasy. And I was just kind of curious what your experience. Have you ever joined a writer's workshop, or what do you think sort of the pitfalls of that might be?
I have been involved in workshops. I was in workshops with poetry for years, and then when I was doing the MFA program, part of being on campus was going to a workshop. And I've gone to some workshops. They're not, in general, they're not a match for me. I usually had to work through the things that were being said, the hurt. I never went to a mean workshop. I never did. I never went to a place where I thought people were just being encouraged to be aggressive and tear things apart. And yet I never really came away with much that I found helpful. But I know that what I've decided is that every writer needs to decide for herself, what works and what doesn't work, and then to develop a lot of confidence in that decision. And yep, sometimes, like when I did the MFA, there's just no way. It's like, okay, you got to go to workshop, try to model for myself what I hoped an experience would be like for others. And even then, I'm sure I failed. One of the things I remember most is another student in a different workshop saying to me, well, they workshop my story today, and usually they're really good, but today they weren't good. And I thought, well, yeah, maybe that's true, or maybe it's just that feeling of, it seems like, oh, we're really on to something, when we're talking about someone else's work. But then when it's your own work being talked about, as I said, for some people, it's profoundly helpful. For me, it was usually just a lot of material that I had to work through to gain my footing again.
Have you had that experience of people being hostile or dismissive because you write fantasy?
I have never had that. I mean, let me back up a little bit. I've never had that experience in workshops. I have run into writing teachers who don't know as much about the subject as they think they do, who might be dismissive before they've even read any of the stuff. And I don't mean just my own material. I mean, have ideas about genre writing in general, but haven't really read it. So I don't know how a person can as an adult be that way. But I've been really fortunate. I've had almost a gift in my life of wonderful teachers and supportive teachers. I haven't really ever run into anyone who knew my work who was dismissive.
Well, that's certainly been my experience with people who are dismissive of fantasy and science fiction. In 99% of the time, they've never actually read any. And I'm firmly convinced that if they read it, they would actually like it.
I think so. I think it's work. I think you have to look around and find who speaks to you. It's the same thing with poetry. There's so much poetry that for a lot of people it's just too much work to find, the writer that they go, wow, I really connect to that. But I think people need to give it a try. And then I think also, as somebody who writes, I feel fantasy. Some people sometimes say it's science fiction, but I think my work is fantasy. I think it's important for me to pick up, a romance novel, to pick up, everything and give it a chance. I'm like, oh, this writer's really popular. Why? There's something that's speaking to readers, and I'm not going to just say that those readers are stupid. There's something there that has a great deal of meaning. And so, yeah, I've read some things where I'm like, wow, I just don't, I don't get this on a sentence level. I don't get this on a lot of levels. But there's a human connection going on, and this writer was able to create that. It's nothing to be dismissed.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we're pretty much out of time. Do you have just any final thoughts or any other projects you're working on that you want to mention?
Well, I'm working on a current novel, and then I also have a short story coming out in the Echoes, the Saga anthology of ghost stories edited by Ellen Datlow, and my short story is called The Shooter. And so that should be coming out this year.
And so what's that story about, The Shooter?
Well, it's about school shootings. And I wrote it months before the one in Florida. I mean, probably 6 months before that. The challenge for me, I wanted to write something about that for years. And the challenge for me was to find a way to write something about that topic that I hope speaks to it without being a violence in itself to be read. So, I hope I did that. That was what I was trying to do, is to speak to a subject that was really important to me and to create an activist voice in fiction without harming somebody who reads it. And that's why I decided to use the title I did. I was like, well, there it is. It's kind of clear where we're going with this.
Well, it's interesting you talk about an activist voice when the Parkland shooting you mentioned has sort of inspired a level of activism that certainly I've never seen before in my lifetime.
Yeah, I believe very strongly that writers can be activists within their fiction. And I have tried to do that in much of my work. And I actually believe everybody can be activists within their work and to decide to live in the way they believe and to create that in their own realities. And so for me as a writer, that to me is one of my tasks, is to speak on an activist level and to try to do it well.
Well, no, I think that's a great thought and a great note to end on. And so that story you just mentioned, it's called Shooter, you said, and it's going to be in this anthology called Echoes, right? Edited by Ellen Datlow. And everyone, also I'll go check out the short story collection that we've been talking about today. It's called You Have Never Been Here. And the author is Mary Rickert. And so, Mary, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, David. And thank you to your listeners. And thank you for everything you do to support fiction.
Oh, thank you. And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Mary Rickert for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to Katie Fulfer, who just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.